It is your Classic Metal Show right here on the ClassicMetalShow.com. You might recognize that song that is Four on the Floor from Cold Sweat, Breakout, from their 1990 release. And I want to welcome back to the Classic Metal Show guitarist Marc Ferrari. How are you, Marc?
Just awesome. Thanks for having me. It's been an interesting few weeks here as I'm dodging wildfires and floods and every other biblical thing going on here in Southern California. But I was evacuated for 4 nights. I almost lost my home, but very lucky that the firemen did such an amazing job here. And my house is safe, and others were not so lucky. I know a couple folks that lost their home, and so it's been a pretty trying few weeks here. So it's certainly a good time to say thanks for everything.
Well,
other than that, I'm fine.
Well, you're one of the very lucky ones. It's been a very trying time for you folks out there on the West Coast, and you know we're well aware of the fires and the devastation that has taken place out there, and we're glad to have you here on the show, safe and sound.
Well, happy to be here.
Well, Marc, we've had you on the Classic Metal Show before. You know, you've been on here to promote some of the Keel projects, but this is a re-release of something that you did outside of Keel. Back when things were kind of changing in the music industry, and we're talking about Cold Sweat here. And there is a re-release of the CD Breakout. And I guess what we want to find out is, after, so many years, what are we talking, 28 years here?
28 years, correct.
That there's an interest enough to re-release the CD remastered for the hardcore fans, which I am one of. So tell us a little bit about how this came about and what spurred this.
Well, as you said earlier, Cold Sweat was one of those bands that kind of, unfortunately, fell under the radar in the early 90s. And as you mentioned, in 1990, we started seeing a little, kind of shift away from commercial hard rock into the grunge movement era. The original Cold Sweat release came out in June of 1990. But by that September, 3-4 months later, we had gotten dropped from the label, and it was kind of a kick in the pants, so to speak. The band has always had this cult following. I've seen some of these websites that have best or most underrated albums from the 90s, and Cold Sweat's on a lot of them. And I'm very flattered that people thought so highly of the band. I do think we made a really solid, well-played, well-crafted, well-written record of commercial hard rock. But we were the victim of certain circumstances, some in our control and others not, as to why the Cold Sweat project did not, take off to the stratosphere like some of our colleagues did. So about a year ago, I got a call from Dave Tedder, who owns the label that's reissuing this. I've known Dave for a long time, and Dave is, independently of our relationship, was working with our singer Roy Cathy. So, and I used to, he knew that I used to work for Universal, so he was like, "What do we need to do here to get this, get this Cold Sweat album re-released?" And it took over a year for us to reach out to Universal. Originally, they couldn't even find the title. This is corporate corporate unbelievableness here. They couldn't even find the title in their catalog, right? And it turns out they were spelling the name of the title Breakout with one word instead of two. That was why they couldn't find it for months. But I kept on kind of pushing the right buttons over at Universal, because I was a Universal Music Group employee for a while and just kind of knew who to go to, and we finally got everything to the finish line on this. And just today, I received my shipment of the Cold Sweat re-release, which I haven't even listened to yet. So as soon as this interview's done, I'm slapping this bad boy on.
Excellent. Now, did they find the original tapes? Did they have the original tapes?
No, we took the original CD and they ingested that and remastered it from that. I don't know where the original 2-inch tapes would be. They're in a vault somewhere, I would imagine. So this was not remastered from the original 2-inch tapes. It was remastered from a CD copy.
Absolutely. Now, who bankrolled the remastering of this and the re-release?
Well, I guess that would be our our faux billionaire record company owner, Dave Tedder. I think Mr. Moneybags there was the one who who's incurred the financial obligations here for the record.
Sure.
But I understand that the pre-sales are really good, and I know this is a pretty highly anticipated release. Throughout the years, I always get asked on Facebook, do I have a copy of this? I actually have it, believe it or not. I have original cassettes, I have original vinyl and original CD, but of course these days we're only re-released it on CD.
Sure, absolutely. Well, physical media, unfortunately, has going to the wayside aside from the hardcore collectors of vinyl. And, that seems to have a resurgence just from the nostalgic aspect of it. Some people like that whole vinyl thing. But I got to be honest with you, Breakout was a very in-your-face, high-energy ass kicker. And let me ask you something, Mark. I mean, obviously you had success in the 80s, being part of Keel and, doing your own thing. Did you see the writing on the wall when this CD was being recorded or you had assembled your band? Did you see the writing on the wall that there was going to be a change in the musical atmosphere, or did you think things were the way that they were?
No, I don't. No, and if you roll back the clock to when Cold Sweat was actually started in 1988, early 1988, right? And we did our first round of demos in '88, and Gold Mountain Records exercised their leaving member clause in my contract, which obligated me to record for them in 1988, and I fully believed that I was going to get a record out in 1988. And 1988 was still. We were still in commercial hard rock heaven back then. As a matter of fact, Bon Jovi's New Jersey record was huge that year, and Winger was huge that year. And, a few other bands. Warrant was huge that year. Poison was huge that year. So '88 was still a pretty decent year for commercial hard rock. And had this album come out in 1988, I fully believe, that we would have had a different trajectory, but it just was not meant to be. Our original singer, Oni Logan, left us actually the day we started setting up our gear in the studio to record this record. He announced he was leaving the band to join the Lynch Mob. Can you imagine what that felt like to us?
Well,
literally, as we're setting up our gear in the studio, our singer leaves the band. So that's a true story. All is forgiven with Oni. He and I have made up many times a long time ago, and very coincidentally, George Lynch and I are very close. We've hung out with each other, been to each other's homes. I love the guy. Back then, maybe I was a little peeved at the parties, but it's all water over the bridge now. We're all on great terms, and. But that's really what caused the delay, was our singer leaving the band, and then it took us a better part of a year, to find the right replacement and to get back in the studio, pre-production, write a few new songs. And then by the time the album was released, it was, the spring or early summer of 1990. And that's when, that was a pivotal 2-year period, because that's when we started to see musical trends shift. So, unfortunately, the Cold Sweat project, was part of that whole, that delay really did hurt the band.
Sure. Now, tell us a little bit about assembling the members or the players in Cold Sweat. How did you arrive at selecting the various, people who played with you.
Yeah, well, the first demo. Well, first of all, the first piece of the puzzle is always the singer, right? You don't have a band without a singer, and so that was the first task, was to find the guy, and that guy was happened to be Oni Logan. Oni came to me via a referral recommendation from a journalist, a gal named Beth Nussbaum. She was the editor for Rock Scene magazine, and she was Florida-based, and Oni was Florida-based, and she knew of Oni. So she put me in touch with him, and yeah, man, the first time I heard him sing, it was like, that's the guy. He had the look, he had the voice, he had the whole package together. So I flew him out. We did a first round of demos that I played guitar and bass on. Fred Corey played drums for me on that demo. And then after that, I had that first demo in hand. It was finding the other guitar player who I wanted at my side, and that took a little time. But I kept hearing the name of Eric Gammons. A couple people told me, "Hey, you should check out this hotshot guitar player. He's 18 years old." He might have been 17 when I first met him. I think he was just shy of his 18th birthday, and he'd already done a stint with Pete Way's band, and he already did some demos with Fiona Flanagan. And again, he had the look, he had the talent, he had the drive. So that was the next piece of the puzzle. And the drummer came, Anthony came recommended to me through Mark Slaughter and Greg Chason. So he was the next one up. And I initially brought in a bass player, a buddy of mine from back east that I was in a cover band with. That was the first lineup, but we had a couple of personnel changes throughout the summer, or after the first demo anyways. We did wind up changing out our bass player after a while, and of course we had to find a new singer after Oni left, and that took a better part of a year, as I mentioned.
Right. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, that's kind of the boiled down version of the assemblage of Cold Sweat.
Sure. Now, what was the status of Keel at that time?
Well, Keel went on without me. They wound up. The next thing they did was their live album, Larger Than Live, which was half live and half studio. So it was one half of the album was a live record, and one half was a studio side. So they brought in, I think I was replaced by a guy named Tony Palmucci, and in addition, Ron brought in a keyboard player. So the band, Keel made they made a left-hand turn after I left in terms of the makeup of the band. That one reason why I left was I was not agreeing with the addition of the keyboard player to Keel. To me, it was such a foreign concept. A guy that was weaned on Maiden and Priest and Scorpions and AC/DC and Aerosmith, and there were some bands that I liked that had keyboards. UFO was a good example of a band that had some keyboards, but it was still a really guitar-oriented band. Deep Purple, I guess, was a good example of a band that used keyboards, but John Lord didn't sound like your typical keyboard player. So I was just, I just was not vibing on the new direction that Ron wanted to go in, and I'm not so sure it was all his doing. There was a lot of pressure from the label in 1988 or 87 after we came off the Bon Jovi tour to get that hit. We had keyboards on some songs on our record, but somebody made a decision to make it a more permanent fixture in the band, and I just wasn't having anything of it.
Well, there you go. You stuck to your principles, and you decided to branch out on your own. Now, how did you get MCA to be interested in making a CD with you? Well, first of all, I had somewhat of a relationship with them already, because don't forget the last Keel album, actually the Final Frontier and the Keel album were both Gold Mountain MCA. So there was that, and then also
there was a great A&R guy working at MCA Records at the time named Brett Hartman, and Brett was just a huge fan of commercial hard rock. He also signed Pretty Boy Floyd, he signed Sweet FA, I believe he signed Steelheart as well. So he was a big commercial hard rock guy, and he had followed my career and was, a fan of what I was doing, and he liked the band, and so he was our biggest cheerleader over there, and he stuck with us for the nearly 1 year period that we actually, we were on our way to set up our gear in the studio and sign our deal like later in the day, when Oni left. But he stuck with us while we, made that torturous summer of auditioning singers and, finally landing on Roy,
Absolutely.
So that's how we came to be at MCA.
Perfect. Well, here we are, almost 30 years later, Mark, and looking back on your career, which you've had an illustrious career, and you've had a very successful career outside of your music roots, and the fact that you still enjoy, being involved with the music business, with all the trials and tribulations and struggles that you went through as a younger musician, trying to, be in a successful band and be signed and have something released, to a time now where there are no record labels per se, and there are no A&R, and there are no promotion, and there is nothing. Would you go back to those days struggling to make it, or do you enjoy today's environment where you more or less got to go out there and, make it or break it on your own via social media or YouTube or whatever it takes to get recognized today?
The internet's been this amazing two-edged sword. Okay, on one side of it, you've got the ability for anybody with any moderate equipment, a MacBook Pro and some software and an internet connection can find an audience, right? They can make your own music. You can put it up there. You can do all the things you mentioned, reaching out to social media, and you can essentially be your own rock star, all right? The flip side of that is now you've got millions of people doing that, and there's so much chatter out there. There's such a glut of people doing that same thing that it really dilutes in my opinion, it dilutes the real special bands that are out there, the real special artists. Back in the 80s, of course, as pre-internet, you had to have the goods. You had to know how to play an instrument. You had to know how to perform, work an audience. You couldn't be afraid to get out there and press the flesh, so to speak. In stores. We used to love doing in stores because you're meeting your fans face to face. You don't have that anymore. There's no stores to do it in store with. So that's the thing about the digital revolution that we've gone through, is that it's really been a two-edged sword. Now I really have a lot of sympathy for new artists that are starting today, because I honestly do feel it's harder. It's harder, I think, to break, using the term of our record, break out from the pack, because there's just so many websites and so many people, that have kind of entered the sandbox and playing in the sandbox now. But I don't regret anything from the 80s. I feel lucky that I was able, I came up through a time where this kind of music was king of the jungle for a long time, and we were out there, doing big shows and big videos and big hair and big. I don't think there's anything wrong with being big, and I think, your listeners will probably agree that they miss that era, and those that are not old enough to have been, been there back in the 80s going to concerts, they would have loved to have been there. It was a real special time.
Absolutely. Well, I lived in that era. You and I are about the same age, Mark, and I appreciate everything about what you do and what that era did. And the Classic Metal Show, we're in our 23rd year here promoting stuff just like Cold Sweat, and we're glad to have you as part of our Classic Metal Show family. And what do you foresee for this release of Cold Sweat? Any chance you would do some shows under the Cold Sweat moniker or not?
Yeah, we've been asked throughout the years, and up to this point in time, I guess I've been the stick in the mud. I've been the one that just was kind of holding back on playing shows. We didn't have any product out there, but now that this is out, I'm of a different mindset. And if the right situation presents itself, I certainly would be open to playing along with the guys again. Now, mind you, we haven't even been in the same room together since 1990, so there's a little bit of dust and rust to scrape off the barnacles off the boat, so to speak. But I think it'd be fun. I think a lot of people would enjoy seeing the band again. We've been offered to go on the Monsters of Rock cruise before. Maybe we'll get there again at some point in time. So that's all I'm going to say is never say never, and you never know.
Right, absolutely. All right, Mark. Well, we appreciate you taking a few minutes out of your day to talk to us here on the Classic Metal Show. The Cold Sweat 1990 release, Breakout, has been remastered. It is available on 20th Century Music. So if you were a fan or maybe are a new fan, you might want to pick that thing up and enjoy it for what it's worth, because it kind of marks a time and space, as it were. And it's just some in-your-face, high-energy rock. Is that fair enough?
I couldn't have said it better myself.
All right, Mark. Well, anything else you want to tell the fans?
Well, just keep the faith. Stay active in supporting live music and buying new. There's some great bands out there too. By the way, there's some really good bands that are newer bands that I like to support new music whenever I can, and just keep on rocking. If you're interested in finding out a little bit more about Cold Sweat, you can visit my website, marcferrari.com. There's a Cold Sweat page up there. Who knows, maybe we'll see you on the road sometime in 2019.
Perfect. All right, Mark. Well, as a tradition here, we always let the artists pick a song from their CD. We already played 4 on the Floor, so what should we play taking us out of this interview, and tell us a quick story about it?
Oh, boy. Well, why don't we go with the Foghat song, I Just Want to Make Love to You, which Foghat was always one of my favorite bands in the 70s. And there's been a lot of great versions of that song throughout the years. Of course, the Stones did it. Foghat did it on their live album. We borrowed very heavily from that one. And I think Tesla did a version, too, around the same year we did. I think theirs came out right around the same time ours did. So that song's pretty special to me. It works really well live, and obviously, it has a lot of heritage. So hopefully, we've done it right.
Perfect. All right, we'll go out and get the Cold Sweat re-release, remastered, Breakout. And here it is. This is Cold Sweat featuring Marc Ferrari. And this is the Foghat cover, I Just Want to Make Love to You, exclusively here on your Classic Metal Show.